Picture this. You are standing in a war tent in the year 722 AD. You are the most powerful military commander on the planet. Your empire stretches from the borders of China to the beaches of Portugal. You have never lost. Your armies have crushed every civilization foolish enough to resist. Persia fell. Egypt fell. North Africa fell. Spain fell in a single afternoon. Now, the scout kneels before you with a report. There are Christians hiding in a cave in the northern mountains. Maybe 300 of them. They are so desperate they are licking honey off the rocks to stay alive. You don't send an army. You don't even send a battalion. You wave your hand dismissively and utter 9 words that will haunt your civilization for the next 8 centuries. What can 30 wild donkeys do to us? You sign their death warrant with that sentence. But not theirs. Yours. Because those starving, freezing, desperate donkeys are about to drag you into a narrow mountain gorge and butcher the greatest army the medieval world has ever seen. They are about to ignite a war that will last 770 years and redraw the map of human civilization. This is the Battle of Covadonga, and it is the story of how arrogance murdered an empire. Before we dive into this forgotten tale of blood and defiance, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden stories that shaped our world, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that we can gather here from every corner of the planet, united by our fascination with the ghosts of the past. To understand why those 9 words were a death sentence, you need to understand velocity. The Umayyad Caliphate wasn't expanding. It was exploding. In the span of a single human lifetime, armies carrying the banner of Islam had conquered more territory than Rome had acquired in 5 centuries. In 711 AD, just 11 years before our story, a general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed a narrow strip of water we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. He brought with him 7,000 Berber warriors. They weren't supposed to conquer Spain. They were supposed to raid it. Grab some gold, grab some slaves, go home. But something unexpected happened. The entire Visigothic kingdom, 300 years of Christian rule, collapsed in a single afternoon. At the Battle of Guadalete, the Spanish king was killed. His generals were slaughtered. His nobles turned traitor. The army didn't retreat. It evaporated. What followed wasn't a war. It was a parade. The Muslim forces marched north, and city after city opened its gates. Toledo, Seville, Córdoba, Zaragoza. The locals didn't resist. Many of them welcomed the invaders as liberators from corrupt Visigothic rule. By the time the Umayyad commanders reached the rainy mountainous north, they had conquered an entire civilization in less than 3 years. They were drunk on victory. They believed, with complete sincerity, that God had chosen them to rule the earth. So when their scouts reported a few hundred refugees hiding in the Picos de Europa, a jagged wall of limestone mountains hugging the northern coast, the generals did the math. Sending an army up those treacherous passes would cost money. It would cost time. It would cost lives. And for what? A handful of starving peasants who would freeze to death by spring? The chronicler al-Makari captured the sentiment perfectly. Let them rot in their cave like the animals they are. Winter will be their executioner. But here is what the Umayyads failed to calculate. Those men in the cave were not peasants. They were the shattered remnants of the Visigothic royal guard, professional soldiers who had survived the apocalypse. They were noblemen who had watched their world burn, and they were led by a man named Pelayo, who wasn't hiding in those mountains. He was hunting the Umayyads gave Pelayo the one resource he needed most: time. 4 years of precious, uninterrupted time to scout every goat path, to stockpile every weapon, to turn every ridge and ravine into a killing ground. While the Caliphate was busy counting its tax revenue and planning its invasion of France, Pelayo was engineering a trap. And when the Umayyad army finally marched into those mountains in 722, expecting a police action, they walked directly into the jaws of a monster they had created through their own contempt. The wild donkeys were ready to kick. To understand the fury burning inside those men in the cave, you have to understand what they had lost. The fall of Visigothic Spain is often described as a military conquest. That is a lie. It was an inside job. The Visigothic kingdom didn't fall to foreign invaders. It committed suicide. By the year 710, the Christian kingdom that had ruled Iberia since the fall of Rome was tearing itself apart. There was no orderly succession. When a king died, the nobles went to war with each other to decide who would sit on the throne next. It was a system designed to produce chaos, treachery, and assassination. In 710, a warrior named Roderic seized the crown through blood and violence. He blinded his rivals. He imprisoned his enemies. He made himself king, but he made half the country hate him in the process. And in the shadows, the men he had humiliated were waiting for revenge. Enter Count Julian. Julian was the governor of Ceuta, a fortress on the North African coast, directly across the strait from Spain. His entire purpose was to guard the gates of Europe. He was the lock on the door. But Julian had a personal grievance. The historical accounts tell us that he sent his daughter to the royal court in Toledo. There, King Roderic saw her, and Roderic took what he wanted. When Julian discovered what had happened to his daughter, he did not challenge the king to single combat. He did not raise an army. He did something far more devastating. He contacted the Muslim commanders in North Africa and offered them a deal. "I will give you the ships," he told them. "I will ferry your soldiers across the strait myself." It is one of the most chilling betrayals in recorded history. The guardian of the gate handed the keys to the enemy because he wanted to watch one man burn. He burned an entire civilization instead. In the spring of 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad landed with his army on the rock that would later bear his name. Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, Gibraltar. King Roderic, who was fighting rebels in the north, heard the news and marched south with 30,000 men. He was annoyed, not afraid. He expected to crush these raiders and return home in time for dinner. The two armies met at the Battle of Guadalete. On parchment, Roderic should have won easily. He had superior numbers. He had heavy cavalry, but he did not have loyalty. As the battle reached its peak, the flanks of Roderic's army, commanded by the very nobles whose families he had destroyed to seize the throne, stopped fighting. Some accounts say they simply watched. Others say they turned their swords on their own king. Roderic died in the chaos. His body was never recovered. All that remained was his white horse, standing riderless by the riverbank, and his golden boots sinking slowly into the mud. With the king dead and the army shattered, the central nervous system of the Visigothic state went dark. There was no plan B. There was no heir. The traitor nobles who had let Roderic die thought the Muslims would loot the treasury and leave. They thought they would be rewarded for their assistance. They were catastrophically wrong. The invaders looked around at the chaos, at the open gates, at the kingdom that had just handed itself over on a silver platter. And they walked right in. Within 2 years, Visigothic Spain was a corpse. The nobles who had betrayed their king were either executed or stripped of everything they owned. They had sold their country for a throne that no longer existed. This was the world Pelayo was living in. He was a high-ranking nobleman, possibly related to Roderic himself. He stood at Guadalete. He watched his king die. He watched his friends butchered. He watched everything he knew disappear into the mud. But unlike the collaborators who knelt to the new masters, Pelayo refused to break. He retreated north, mile by bloody mile, as the green tide of Islam swallowed the peninsula behind him. By 718, the conquerors had captured him and dragged him to Córdoba, the new capital where they kept him as a hostage. They wanted to domesticate him. They wanted to make him a tame puppet, like the other surviving Visigothic nobles. They underestimated him completely. Pelayo waited. He watched, and when his moment came, he slipped his chains and ran. But he didn't run to France to hide among the Franks. He ran back into the fire. He ran to Asturias, the wildest, harshest corner of Spain, where the Umayyad cavalry could not follow. While Pelayo had been rotting in Córdoba, a different kind of conquest was underway in his homeland. The Muslim governor of the northern province was a man named Munuza. Unlike the generals who had swept through Spain with fire and sword, Munuza preferred politics. He preferred strategic marriages, and he had set his sights on a specific prize: Pelayo's sister. The accounts differ on whether she was forced or whether it was arranged, but the meaning was unmistakable. Munuza wanted to marry into the old royal bloodline to legitimize his rule. To Pelayo, this was the final humiliation. The conqueror was taking the last thing the conquered had left. When word reached Córdoba that Munuza was moving to claim his sister, something inside Pelayo shattered. The passive hostage died. The rebel was born. He escaped from Córdoba, we don't know exactly how, and covered nearly 500 miles of enemy territory to reach the north. He arrived too late to stop Munuza's influence from spreading, but just in time to start a war. Pelayo confronted the governor directly. He walked into the lion's den and openly defied the representative of the Caliphate. Munuza, likely astonished by the audacity, ordered his arrest. What happened next became legend. Pelayo fought his way out. There is a famous account of him fleeing across the Pelayo River, clinging to his horse as arrows splashed into the water around him. He was not merely escaping, he was migrating. He was leaving the occupied world behind and heading for the one place on the Iberian Peninsula where the Umayyad war machine could not follow. The Picos de Europa. These are not gentle hills. These are vertical walls of limestone teeth rising straight out of the sea, constantly shrouded in rain and fog and mist. To the local Asturians, they were home. To an invading army, they were a death sentence. As Pelayo moved through the villages and valleys, something extraordinary happened. People began to follow him. They were Visigothic nobles who had lost their lands. They were peasants crushed by taxes. They were young men who had grown up in the shadow of defeat and never known a leader who wasn't afraid. In Pelayo, they saw something that had been missing for a decade. Defiance. By the time he reached the mountain sanctuary, Pelayo had a small army of desperate followers. They held a council, not in a cathedral, but in the mud and rain of the highlands. There, standing on a pile of rocks, Pelayo was proclaimed prince. To Governor Munuza, sitting comfortably in his palace in Gijon, this was a joke. A fugitive playing king in the woods. He assumed the mountains would do his killing for him. Cold, hunger, disease. Why waste soldiers on men who were already dead? This was his fatal error. For 4 years, from 720 to 722, Pelayo consolidated his forces. He stockpiled weapons. He scouted every narrow pass. He studied the terrain until he knew it better than his own heartbeat. He wasn't waiting to be found. He was waiting for his enemy to walk into the trap. The location Pelayo chose for his last stand was a place called Covadonga. The name comes from Latin, Cova Dominica, the cavern of the lady. It is a natural cave, carved into the sheer face of a cliff, overlooking a narrow valley where 2 rivers converge. To reach the cave, an attacking army must funnel through a deep, wooded gorge. In military terms, this is a force multiplier. It doesn't matter if you have 10,000 soldiers or 10 million. The valley is so narrow that only a handful of men can fight at any one time. Think of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held the hot gates against the Persian Empire. Covadonga was even better. At Thermopylae, the Persians could eventually find a way around. At Covadonga, there was no way around. There was only the cliff face on one side and the raging river on the other. In the spring of 722, the Umayyad army finally came. They were commanded by a general named al-Qama, and they brought with them an unlikely negotiator, Bishop Oppa. Oppa was a Visigothic churchman of royal blood who had chosen collaboration over resistance. He had kept his wealth in his head by bowing to the new rulers in Córdoba. Now he rode forward on a mule to offer Pelayo one final chance to surrender. The Chronicle of Alfonso III records the exchange. While we must treat medieval speeches with skepticism, the essence of this confrontation is preserved. Oppa shouted up to the cave, "Pelayo, you are a reasonable man. You understand reality. The entire army of the Goths, with all their strength and glory, could not resist the Ishmaelites. Every great city in Spain has fallen. How can you, on this little mountain, hope to succeed where a kingdom failed?" The bishop offered a deal. "Come down. Pledge loyalty. You will be allowed to govern this region as a friend of Córdoba. You will have wealth. You will have safety. You will have a future." For the starving, freezing men huddled in that cave, this offer must have been almost unbearable. Why die for a world that no longer existed? But Pelayo's answer echoed across the centuries. "Have you not read in sacred scripture," he shouted back, "that the church of the Lord is like a grain of mustard seed? Though it is the smallest of all seeds, it grows to become the greatest of trees." His voice rang off the limestone walls. "I will not make peace with the Arabs. I will not submit to their authority. For we trust in the mercy of God, that from this little hill the salvation of Spain shall come." From this little hill. Bishop Oppa turned his mule around and delivered his report to General al-Qama. "He will not yield. You must fight, but be warned, only God knows what the outcome will be. Al-Qama was unimpressed. He had heard defiant speeches before, usually moments before his soldiers crushed the speaker into the dirt. He looked up at the cave, at the ragged group of rebels, and saw target practice. He raised his hand. The war drums thundered. The order was given. Archers and slingers moved into position at the base of the valley. Their mission was simple: rain death into the cave mouth until the defenders were suppressed, then send the infantry to storm the slope. The first volley of arrows darkened the sky. And then something incredible happened. The cave of Covadonga is not a deep tunnel. It is a shallow overhang. When arrows are fired from below, at a steep angle, they strike the stone ceiling. And when a high-velocity projectile hits hard rock at an acute angle, it doesn't stick, it bounces. The medieval chronicles call it a miracle. Modern physics calls it geometry. The Umayyad archers were firing into a stone bowl. Their own arrows shattered against the rock and came raining back down on their own heads. Panic erupted in the front ranks. Soldiers were being struck by their own missiles. They looked up, confused, shielding their faces from the deadly hail. And in that moment of chaos, Pelayo gave the signal. From the cave, from the trees, from every hidden ridge, the wild donkeys attacked. They didn't march in disciplined formations. They poured down like an avalanche. The psychological shock was absolute. But the 300 men in the cave were only the bait. The real trap was waiting above. Hidden along the high ridges, concealed in the morning fog, were Pelayo's reserves. Villagers, farmers, refugees. They had spent weeks loosening massive boulders and stacking heavy logs. When the signal came, the ridges erupted. Tons of stone and timber crashed into the valley floor. Imagine the horror inside that gorge. The Umayyad soldiers were packed shoulder to shoulder, a river of steel and flesh, confined by walls of rock. When the avalanche hit, there was nowhere to run. The rear guard was still pushing forward, unaware of the carnage ahead. The vanguard was trying to retreat. The result was a human crush. Men were trampled by their own horses. The legendary discipline of the Caliphate's armies dissolved in seconds. General al-Qama did not flee. He tried to rally his men, to create space for a counterattack. But in a narrow gorge, a general is just another man on a horse. The chronicles record that al-Qama fell in the thick of the slaughter, cut down by the very wild donkeys he had mocked. With their commander dead, the Umayyad army broke completely. Soldiers who had never known defeat threw down their weapons and ran. But the path of retreat was blocked by their own reinforcements, and the debris still raining from above. The rout became a massacre. The river Deva, which flows through the valley, was said to have run red for days. Those who escaped the killing floor fled east through the mountain passes, hoping to reach flat ground where their cavalry might still save them. They didn't know they were running into something even worse. The retreat took the survivors through a place called Cosgaya, a treacherous landscape of unstable slopes and river gorges. As thousands of panicked men and horses stampeded along a narrow track beside the river, the earth began to groan. Whether it was the weight of the army, the vibration of the stampede, or the heavy rains that plagued this region, the result was catastrophic. The mountainside gave way. A massive landslide roared down and buried the retreating column alive. The Chronicle of Alfonso III describes it with religious awe. The mountain fell upon them, and they were buried there. The entire expeditionary force simply ceased to exist. No messengers returned to Córdoba. No survivors limped home to tell the tale. An army marched into the mountains and vanished. This total annihilation created a psychological barrier that would last for centuries. The mountains of Asturias were no longer merely inconvenient. They were cursed. The Umayyad military, pragmatic to its core, calculated the cost and decided, never again. They would raid the north in years to come, but never again would they attempt permanent conquest of those peaks. While the landslides were burying the army, Governor Munuza was waiting in Gijon for victory celebrations. Instead, he received silence, then whispers, then terror. Survivors from the battle's periphery trickled into the city, speaking of a massacre, of mountains that fell from the sky, of an army that couldn't be killed. Munuza understood immediately that the wind had changed. The countryside that had been passive under his rule was suddenly hostile. The fear had left the people's eyes. It had been replaced by something far more dangerous. Hope. Munuza gathered his treasury and fled south. Pelayo hunted him down. The interception occurred at a valley called Olalias. It was not a battle. It was an execution. With Munuza dead and al-Qama buried, there was not a single Umayyad combat unit left in Asturias. The impossible had happened. The rebels gathered once more, but this time they were not fugitives. They were conquerors. Following the ancient Germanic tradition of their Visigothic ancestors, the warriors lifted Pelayo onto a shield and raised him above their heads, proclaiming him king. It was a coronation without cathedrals or gold. They were only battered survivors in dented armor. But it was the birth of a nation. The kingdom of Asturias was barely a speck on the map, a few valleys and a lot of rocks. But it was free, and from that tiny seed, something enormous would grow. Pelayo ruled for 15 more years and died in his bed in 737, a remarkable achievement for a man in his profession. But his true legacy was the template he created. His successors expanded the buffer zone, depopulating the land south of the mountains to create a scorched earth barrier that no Umayyad army could cross. Behind that wall of emptiness, a new society formed. The wild donkeys evolved into wolves. The war Pelayo started, the Reconquista, would last 770 years. When Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada in 1492, they saw themselves not as beginning something new, but as completing Pelayo's mission. Without Covadonga, there would be no Spain, no Portugal, no Queen Isabella to fund Columbus. The languages, religions, and cultures of 2 continents would be unrecognizable. The map of the modern world was drawn in that cave. Today, you can still visit the holy cave of Covadonga. Inside, carved into the rock, is a simple tomb. The inscription reads, "Here lies King Pelayo, who in this wondrous place began a new kingdom from the ashes." He reminds us that history is not always written by empires. Sometimes it is written by a handful of desperate people who refuse to kneel. The Battle of Covadonga teaches us that even when the map is painted in the enemy's colors, as long as one spark survives in a dark cave, the fire can still spread. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations of history's hidden turning points. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was Pelayo's victory destiny, or was it a miracle? I'll see you in the next one.